Welcome back to the third and final day of our One Country Rural Progress Summit. This afternoon is going to be very, very dynamic given everything that's happening right now in the world of politics and in the world of public policy. But I want to kind of preview expectations and ask you to stay with us for the rest of the day because it will promise to be very enlightening and very probably entertaining at this point. So what we're going to hear from Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson. She's going to discuss her experiences with election security and how she's keeping democracy safe in Michigan. Author David Pepper will join us to discuss his book, Laboratories of Autocracy and Saving Democracy. Tim Miller and Jonathan Cott will join me to have a discussion on the 2024 elections and some of the key races and candidates to watch. That one might have taken on a little more prominence and significance by the events overnight. Insight expert Doug Usher will provide analysis of electoral performance in rural areas and if Democratic candidates are experiencing any increase in support in recent elections in rural America. And to close out the day, we're going to have to let my brother talk. My brother Joel Heitkamp, who hosts a radio show in the upper Midwest as a more moderate Democrat called News and Views. He also co-hosts our One Country podcast, The Hot Dish, and he'll be joined by Pat Kretlow and a number of other people to discuss the future of media in rural America. But to kick things off today, we're going to discuss the threats to American democracy, some of the innovations being proposed to protect the ballot access and expand voter rights. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I get asked all the time as a former senator and somebody who's been in politics a long time, don't we need to change the Constitution to get rid of the Electoral College? Do we need to change the Constitution so senators are elected by popular, by size of the state? You know, the complaint always that North Dakota has 2 senators, so does California. There's a lot within our current structure that you can have legitimate issues with and concerns about. But I think there's been not enough kind of public awareness of what the options are for electoral reform within our present system and how we can, in fact, elect maybe more moderate candidates where we don't have the extremes of either party kind of selecting our candidates so that when election day comes, there's no one who speaks to our views. And so we've asked some experts in this field to come together and have a discussion with us on how do we keep our democracy safe within the current constraints. And so I'm going to do a quick introduction for all of them, and then we're going to open it up to comments. So Nancy Wang is a law professor at the University of Michigan when she became a founding member and executive director of Voters, Not Politicians. She led a team of volunteers that surveyed voters, researched redistricting processes across the country, and worked with national experts to write a constitutional amendment that established Michigan's Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Danielle Allen, is a professor of public policy and politics and ethics at Harvard University. She is the director of Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics. She is also has received some of Harvard's highest honors. She's a founder and president of Partners in Democracy, where she continues to advocate for democracy reform to create greater voices and access to in our democracy and drive progress towards a new social contract that serves and includes all of us. David Daly is a senior fellow for Fair Vote, the author of, and I won't say it, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. I can never, kind of not say that word without saying that word. So we'll just skip over that. That book has helped spark the recent drive to reform gerrymandering. David's second book, Unrigged: How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy, chronicles the victories and defeats in state efforts to reform elections and uphold voting rights. He is everywhere. You've seen him. He has been a staple in American journalism and in this discussion. And so I'm going to start out. I think, Nancy, if you could, we need your video up. Thank you. There's Danielle. There's David, and there's Nancy. Nancy, why don't you kick us off and just give us maybe 3 minutes of what your work is, why you think that work is important to the future of democracy.
Great. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So I'm Nancy. We started a grassroots voter-led all-volunteer effort here in Michigan in 2016 to end gerrymandering in Michigan, because we saw that this was the number one structural issue that was preventing people's voices from being heard in Lansing. And what happened was we recruited volunteers. We ended up with 8,000 volunteers who collected 428,000 signatures, who funded ourselves, and we put our question on the ballot, having to go through the Michigan Supreme Court to do that. And we won in 2018 with 61% of the vote. So, and since then, we've been working on making sure that the commission was doing the work as it was supposed to. Our reform is in the form of a constitutional amendment to protect it from politicians forever. And it's made up of, our commission is made up of citizens, everyday voters who volunteered to serve in this position. It's a mix of Republicans and independents and Democrats. They have to work together and come to some consensus. And they did that. There's very strict criteria in the Constitution that they have to follow. Everything is very transparent. And in 2021, they adopted our first set of citizen drawn maps, which, for our state, which then led to, in 2022, a flip of the legislature. Now we have a Dem-controlled legislature in both houses and the governor's office for the first time in a generation. And that's not because voters, hadn't chosen, a majority of voters had chosen Democrats in the past. It's just that gerrymandering had really manipulated their votes so that the people's will was subverted. So we are an example of what people can do. Everyday people can get together, at least in initiative states, and make the change that we want to see happen, and make the change that politicians will never do themselves. And on top of this victory in ending gerrymandering, we also run another ballot initiative to protect voting rights. And so slowly, step by step, we're taking our political power back.
Yeah, 61%. Congratulations. That's pretty impressive. Daniela, can you kind of tell us what lane you're working in and why you think that's important to kind of tell the rest of the country what you're doing, but also to preserving democracy?
Sure. Thank you so much, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. David, nice to see you again. And Nancy, such a pleasure to meet you. Katie Fahey and I were on a call just a couple of days ago, and I'm such a huge admirer of the work that was done in Michigan. You have inspired all of us, it has to be said. I think we're all trying to follow in your wake. So I'm president of an organization called Partners in Democracy, and we work toward what we call our 360-degree standard for healthy democracy. We're really focused on holistic strategies for renovating our democracy. What does that mean exactly? Well, the right to vote is a cornerstone for sure. You've got to protect that, make sure the right to vote is easily accessible. But the truth is, the right to vote doesn't actually get us anything if we don't also have choice, if we don't have competitive elections. And that really speaks to that gerrymandering point. It speaks to issues of ballot access. It speaks to issues, honestly, of how our party primaries sort of capture the process and block so many people out from participating. I'll come back to that one in a second. Because then there's a third thing, too. Even if you have the right to vote in competitive elections, that still doesn't get you a responsive, accountable democracy unless you can also see what your elected officials are up to. So we talk about a third bucket, the right to see and shape your community. And issues of the quality of local journalism are involved there, issues of campaign finance and the like. So we really work to do kind of holistic analysis, state by state, the democracy renovations each state needs. We're focused in Massachusetts right now with a little bit of work in Ohio. And here in Massachusetts, the thing we think we most need is to get rid of party primaries, to use that Alaska model that we just all saw come in, where you can have all-comers preliminary, folks from different parties all on one ballot. All voters get to participate, so candidates are incented to campaign to the general electorate, take a group of finalists forward, We say it should be 5 finalists forward to the final round, and then you use an instant runoff in that final round to ensure that whoever wins has to get over that 50% threshold. So that's the renovation that we're advocating for in Massachusetts. But again, the point I really want to drive home is that every state has a really specific jurisdictional structure and context. And so it really is important to do the analysis, like what strategically makes sense in a given state. So that's why independent redistricting mattered so much in Michigan. In Massachusetts, our biggest problem is not that, it's the party primary problem.
Yeah. Catherine Gale, who has been doing a lot of work on Final Five, was supposed to join us, but she's under the weather. And so I can tell you that the work that she's been doing and John Arnold has been advancing has been absolutely so critical. And I want to make this point. I think when you look at it, you think, oh, is this a partisan thing? Because it worked out pretty well to elect moderates and, in fact, a Democrat to the Congress in Alaska. But this challenge is being met and opposed by the Democratic Party right now in Nevada. And so it's like the dominant political party does not like this change. But in the end, it is such an important piece if we are going to have, in fact, voter choice, where voters aren't, how many times have we all heard, well, I plugged my nose, I didn't really have a choice, or he's better than the other guy, I guess, or she's, I don't like her much, but I sure don't like the other guy. And that shouldn't be how we elect our leaders, the least objectionable. And that's why I think this system has worked well in Alaska, it's worked well up in Maine, and it has provided voter choice, especially for minority people in my context, who you may want to support, or at least be able to provide a second choice for a moderate Republican in a state like North Dakota, as opposed to somebody who is absolutely on the right wing. And I think when you look at state legislatures, you can see the effect of party primary voting, particularly at that level. I mean, you think it's bad in Congress, look across the country and see who is basically making decisions for states. Well, David, you have been in this lane for a long time. Tell us how your proposals are going to save democracy.
Well, thank you, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with Nancy and Danielle, who are two inspirations and heroes in this world as well, who have been doing this work for an awful long time. I think what a decade ago when I started writing about these topics, we were talking about them very differently. People talked about gerrymandering and redistricting as if this was a product of the big sort, that it sort of magically happened, that we were divided into these districts that reliably elected candidates of the choosing of the map makers as opposed to the choosing of the voters. And it was because we had sort of magically moved and sorted ourselves. And I think what we have seen over the course of the last decade, as these maps have held an entrenched power in the hands of those who drew them, is that was not the case at all. That we were sorted, and that we have to begin the process really of talking about all of these issues much differently. When I was reporting the book that the senators so wisely will not name, I went into so many offices on Capitol Hill, and I talked to so many members of Congress and others, and I said, well, the rules of the deck are stacked against the American people. The rules of the deck are stacked against voters. Why don't you talk about that? And they said, oh, no, we can't do that. We've focus grouped it and people don't understand it. I had no choice in the title of that book, Senator. I'm very sorry. My publisher said, we can't use the word gerrymander in the title of a book. It's just too boring. It will put people to sleep. And the reality is that I think we all now have a much deeper understanding of not only the structural issues that you mentioned at the top, things like the Electoral College and the Senate, the U.S. Supreme Court, all of these things that I'm sure we can talk about today, and how all these structural pieces, I think, have encouraged a sort of entrenched minority rule by one party. But that we also have to talk about all of the ways that this has been intentionally done to us by politicians for their own purposes. That it's not natural, not all of it is structural. Some of it is quite intentional. And the result of all of this has been this entrenched one-party minority rule in much of the country. The effect of this has been to exacerbate much of the structural problems that already lean in that direction. And the effect of this really has been to create so many uncompetitive districts, as Daniel talked about, that oftentimes produce winners with 20-25% of the vote, or not winners, right? When you win an election with 25% of the vote, it means 75% of the people voted against you for somebody else. And what we need to do is talk about the reality of the problem, which has really been the focus of the work that I have tried to do in going around the country and chronicling the problems, but also the movements to fight back against them, whether in Michigan, in Maine, in Idaho, in Alaska, in Florida, so many places, and to highlight the kinds of solutions, whether it's redistricting reform, whether it's ranked choice voting, whether it's Final Five, whether it's a U.S. House, whether it's multi-member districts used in conjunction with ranked choice voting. That there are things that we can do, but it is imperative that in this moment we're having a real national conversation about it.
Well, and just to give you a sense, in the city of Fargo, they have ranked choice voting. It has produced a city commission that doesn't reflect the North Dakota political leanings of the legislature. So their first reaction was to ban ranked choice voting in North Dakota. That wasn't successful, but it tells you everything you need to know about how those people in power want to stay in power, so that they don't have to appeal to a broader group of the citizens and the voters. And we can't leave this topic or not have a conversation about what the court did yesterday in Alabama. And I think it surprised a lot of people, because this is clearly a majority conservative court. However, two conservatives crossed over to basically vote with three more liberal members to basically call out the Alabama redistricting. I guess it raises the question for all three of you: how important are these kinds of litigation, these lawsuits, in creating an area where you can do electoral reform, because that what they're doing has basically been nullified by the courts? How important are this litigation that's going on all over the country? Danielle, maybe you can start us out.
Well, I'm glad you brought up yesterday's results, because, of course, that was a real surprise and really exciting to see that voters in Alabama, voters of color in particular, African Americans, continue to have their voting power. Space is being made for that. And the map was rejected. So that was really good news. I think it speaks partly to the issues around the Supreme Court. There are so many questions around the court's legitimacy. There's been a lot of heat on that subject. It looks to me like the court was responding to that, in all honesty, that they were beginning to worry about how much they were eroding their own authority by breaking with precedent. Nonetheless, even if that's the cause, I'm grateful for the outcome. That said, I do think we're at a moment where we have to anticipate that the framework of the Voting Rights Act is not durable over the long term at this point, and therefore we need alternative strategies, including, as David alluded to, multi-member districts with ranked choice voting. So I do think there's a lot of work to do. I do think litigation supports this work. We really, at the end of the day, need all of the tools in the toolkit. I mean, I'm a big believer in doing the work to give legislators the chance to do the right thing in the first place. So I'm a big believer in inside advocacy, but I also think you have to supplement that both with pressure from outside the State House building always and litigation. I think you always need all the tools.
Nancy, were you surprised by the decision?
Unfortunately, yes, right, given this court. The reality is every time we want to take up a project like campaign finance, we really want to, change the structure, all the structural deficiencies that we have with our democracy in Michigan. We have to think down the line as to what is the Supreme Court going to do, to kind of tear all this down and make our efforts kind of worth not at the very end. But the thing is, all the tools in the toolbox, we know that we have the support of the people, we have our state constitution, and we're making use of all of the different, ways that we can make change. And that is what we did with redistricting and putting it, into the Michigan Constitution. But of course, we did have concerns that the U.S. Supreme Court would kind of kneecap the ability of states to choose how they do redistricting. That's just unfortunately one of the things that we're always keeping an eye out for these days.
We have to have a very robust presence and watchdog in terms of what's happening. And people have to feel the threat of litigation. They have to, and I think that's going to heighten what happened yesterday is going to heighten people's awareness. They're going to say, look, we can do this. But it may not be lasting. I want to, before we turn to you, David, I just want to comment a little bit on campaign finance because, a lot of people are like, well, this Citizens United, that's a federal case. Why can't states be more aggressive? And, I always remind people the underpinnings of Citizens United was Buckley versus Vallejo. And Buckley versus Vallejo came to one conclusion: money is speech. And after you say money is protected under the First Amendment, the states are obligated. But there's, again, looking to the kinds of reforms that you can do within the context of that. I mean, in fact, Scalia, in his opinion, said, look, you can have transparency, you can have reporting, but the Congress has never adopted the kind of response to dark money, which is sunshine. I mean, there and both sides play this game. I'm not going to allege that I'm always innocent in this, but it has created a system where we don't know who is spending money to buy elections, and so you don't have to reverse Buckley versus Vallejo to have transparency, I guess is what I'm saying, and so again, going back to the kind of notion that, yes, we're frustrated that the court adopted Citizens United on the back of Buckley versus Vallejo, but we haven't taken the modest steps that we need to take that can constitutionally be, constitutionally available to us to at least disinfect this kind of dark money world. David, what do you think about the courts and how important the courts are to this dialogue?
I think that this court has been a wrecking crew on voting rights. I think you can take it back to, John Roberts' decision, first in the Indiana voter ID case, and then I think you can track it through the campaign finance cases, whether Wisconsin Right to Life and then Citizens United, and then through the long line of democracy-related cases over the course of the last decade, which I'd start with Shelby County versus Holder and the evisceration of the preclearance regime of the Voting Rights Act, in which the Chief Justice assured us that things had changed in the South, and the very afternoon that they enacted that decision, Texas put its voter ID into place, and North Carolina and Tennessee and Alabama and everyone else followed, a sign that, perhaps things had not changed as much as the Chief Justice believed that they had. And then you can track that through, Common Cause versus Rucho on partisan redistricting, on the Brnovich case that on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And the court has been willing to just fundamentally make up the law. In Citizens United, the questions in front of them were not really in front of them. They chose, in fact, they demanded that case be re-argued to get to the answer that they wanted that case to produce. Shelby County, the Chief Justice's opinion rests on this notion of equal sovereignty among states, which doesn't exist. There's no such doctrine of equal sovereignty among states. And conservative law professors have been pointing this out all along, right? In the Brnovich decision, they completely rewrote Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, added text effectively that simply did not exist. So the courts have been, eroding democratic protections have been at the heart of this court's project for the last decade plus. What happened yesterday is good news. It's important news, but I think we still have to be on guard. There's a couple of really important cases coming up on affirmative action in college admissions, and then there's more v. Harper on the independent state legislative doctrine, which could still undermine the ability of states to handle redistricting and a whole lot of other things. So we have to remain very vigilant here.
Well, I want to turn to a discussion about kind of the reaction to the professionalism across the country of election officials, whether it's Maricopa County, whether it is those officials who were Republicans in very Republican districts, basically saying, hey, we're counting votes the way we've always counted votes. There is no fraud in this election. We are running elections the way they need to be run. It's, we would have wished for a different outcome, but there is not fraud in this election. So what's the reaction to this? Among very conservative state legislatures is to try and reverse that power and take that power to the state legislatures. You can only imagine what would have happened during the Stop the Steal dialogue had these state legislators had the ability to reverse an election. How big of a threat is this kind of nationwide? What are you seeing in terms of trends? And David, we'll go in reverse order. Why don't you kind of give us a rundown on what I think is a very dangerous emerging threat to our democracy, which is partisans deciding elections as opposed to voters?
Yes, I think this is absolutely crucial, right? I mean, the threat on January 6th was in many ways, right, a mob at the Capitol. But the threat on January 6th was also the members inside. And it was the members inside in suits and ties who voted overwhelmingly on the Republican side in the House not to accept legitimate certified election results from two states. And the campaign that John Eastman cooked up in order to, have Mike Pence that they wanted Mike Pence to exercise was all about manipulating election results in state legislatures, and it's all about manipulating election results in state legislatures in the most competitive states that have been the most deeply gerrymandered. So all of this is connected. It's all sort of so closely interwoven, right? I mean, if you look at 2020, you had about 80,000 votes that decided the election. When you look at the results in Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, and then the single electoral vote in the Omaha area of Nebraska. And if those state legislatures using the pretext of fraud to say that these elections were just too close, we're going to throw them out. And voter fraud, by the way, has been a pretext that folks have used to overturn elections or to attempt to impugn election results in this country. It has a dark racial history. It goes back as long as this country has been around. This has been a problem, but it is exacerbated now by the fact that at so many levels, you have state legislators who have been elected with such a slender amount. You have legislatures that have been gerrymandered so that people can't oftentimes change control in these states. And you have a court that in many ways has become deeply committed to this anti-democratic project. And the combination of all of these things ties us up in knots.
Nancy, obviously, you were able to change the Michigan legislature. And I want to make this point, how important, I mean, I think everybody's going to be so hyper-focused in 2024 on the presidential, on who's going to control the Senate. But so much of what's happening in our democracy, whether it is banning books or taking away rights of people, happens in these state legislatures. And when you don't have a court that's willing to protect those rights, it is so alarming. It should be so alarming to the people of this country. So when you look at these other states that are basically building a case for state legislature takeover of elections from election officials, what advice do you have to those states in trying to get legislatures that are more accountable to protect our democracy?
I don't know about advice, but I would say that in 2022, one of the things, we were one of the states that were under extreme threat by these election deniers. We had at the top of the ticket all the way down election denier candidates that were far outside, the most extreme of the extreme. And what we did at that point was we were lifting up pro-democracy candidates, and we were telling voters, trying to impress on voters how important this election was. It really was about a candidate that supports democracy and a candidate that wants to tear it down. And we were one of many, many groups that were out there engaging with voters. And I will say our clerks were doing that as well. I think information to combat misinformation is really important in Michigan, for better or worse. We have 1,600 individual clerks. So our election system is very decentralized. So we absolutely did have some bad actor clerks, who were refusing to certify the election or election results, or were kind of spreading conspiracy theories. But for the most part, and I will say, continuing till today, our clerks are getting together and in a bipartisan fashion, reassuring the public, trying to open up, the election system, the election process of their offices to the public, to kind of walk people through and restore this confidence. And and absolutely, it matters who wins office, right? It matters who your Secretary of State is. Absolutely.
And I want to make this point. People say, "Oh well, they are just doing what the voters want," right? They're just you can't win this. You won it by 61% in Michigan. I mean, that's an incredible margin. It tells you that the voters are hungry for reforms that make a difference, and you were able to message it, and you were able to get the voters' support. Danielle, I'm so curious about your work. Our common purpose, your advocacy is for the expansion of Congress to have districts representing a smaller number of constituents, which is interesting, and rebalance the Electoral College to more closely follow the will of popular vote. And so tell us about, kind of these very creative, innovative kind of ideas that you have, whether they would take a constitutional amendment or whether these are things that there could be a collaboration and a voter push or a vote in Congress or a vote in states to make this happen. Tell us about some of those unique ideas.
Thanks so much. Yes, this is a report that was the work of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. That's an organization that is older than the country. It was set up during the Revolution by the same people who led the Revolution. Hancock and Franklin, George Washington was an early member. And it was set up so that this kind of new country, this kind of crazy experiment in self-government among free and equal citizens, would always have access to the knowledge resources it would need to tackle hard problems. So over its several centuries of existence, the Academy has mounted commissions on challenging issues. For example, it did a lot of work on nuclear power, nuclear proliferation in the middle of the 20th century. And in recent years, the president of the Academy was of the view that democracy was one of our biggest, hardest problems. And so we pulled together a commission. We spent a lot of time talking with Americans all over the country about what people saw as the problems blocking their participation or their sense of value in our democracy. And this yielded, I should say, it was a cross-partisan group of people. So the commission members, span the waterfront from the point of view of political positions, as well as professional sectors and things like that. We put out a report in June 2020 with 31 recommendations, and they are bold and ambitious. And my favorite is that we should increase the size of the House of Representatives. The basic idea there is that the Congress is the first branch of government. It's the first branch for a reason. It has the job of communicating the voice of the people. It has the job of synthesizing the voice of the people, of establishing a sort of steering direction for the country. And of the two branches, the House of Representatives is the branch that's meant to be closest to the people. It's supposed to be proportional to the people and the like. And it was always supposed to grow. So in the very beginning, the ratio was 1 representative to 30,000 constituents. And the only time George Washington weighed in at the Constitutional Convention was to sort of vote that number down to make that relationship tighter and closer. And then it was expected to grow every 10 years with the census. And 100 years ago, we stopped having the House grow. This has meant that now we have, every representative on average representing 750,000 people. The bigger districts get, the farther people are away from their constituents, don't have that same full depth of organic knowledge. It takes more money to run in a bigger district. And so right now with a capped House, we're just looking at the problem getting worse and worse, basically. So we advocate that it is time to let the House grow again, to do the deferred maintenance, the seats we lost over the last 100 years. That would take us up to 585 members of Congress. And there's lots to be said about the kind of responsiveness and proximity we would get, better information ecosystems for handling elections and the like, if we could go ahead and uncap the size of the House of Representatives. And it does not take a constitutional amendment. It's purely a matter of legislation.
It's interesting. And when you couple that with what happened during the pandemic, and you can argue about whether it was good to have proxy voting, whether you could stay in your district, but I would imagine that if you're going to expand, there may be a lot of people who are much more interested in staying in their district and being at home, not in Washington, subject to the kind of political power that exists there, but subject to the power of the people in their home district. I mean, it would be really an interesting House of Representatives. There's no doubt about it. So proxy voting in conjunction with that might make people more accountable directly. I want to, David, ranked choice voting. A lot of people don't like it. They think, I don't want to pick a second. I'm a big fan of it because one of the kinds of opportunities, the reason why politics turn people off is so often it's so nasty, right? People say things about people. They just don't. By the end, those 30-second commercials. Yeah, I mean, there's no one in America who thinks that is good for the body politic to have that level of rancor and ugliness on television. So if you have ranked choice voting, talk about how it will change the tenor potentially of elections. How if I want Kevin Cramer's voters to pick me second, I'm probably going to be nicer to Kevin Cramer during the campaign, right? And so talk about what you're seeing across the country in terms of how ranked choice voting has changed the tenor and the overall atmosphere of elections.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that kind of choice really is natural to Americans. When we go to the grocery store or no matter what, we appreciate choice, and we always have a backup, right? If our favorite, if you go in and the thing you intend to buy isn't there, what your second choice is. We all have second choices, and in politics, it's the same way. I imagine if you're a Republican in 2016, you probably had several lanes of candidates that were okay to you and a bunch on the bottom that were not. If you're a Democrat in 2020, you probably felt the same way about a large field. What we need, though, whenever we have those large fields, are the tools to actually make choice something positive and not be weaponized against us. Because right now, when you have 25 candidates in a field, in some of these congressional races, you often see 17, 18, 19 candidates running. Somebody can win with as little. There was an election in Oklahoma last year that was run by a candidate, about 13% of the vote in the first round, because there were so many candidates running. Again, that's not winning. So if you force candidates to earn a majority, if you force them to get to 50% plus one, they have to campaign differently. They have to talk to more people. They have to have a different tone than if they know that they can win with 13% in a low turnout August primary, only appealing to the most extreme members of their base. You could then see that a different breed of candidate wins, and then a different kind of candidate goes to office and then is incentivized to behave differently once they're in office. And I think that really is the beauty of ranked choice voting. Instead of putting that 13, 14% in charge, it puts the rest of us in charge. And those who are against it are the ones who are trying to control elections from the 13 or 14%. There's a reason why the folks who have these uncompetitive districts and who won these primaries with such a small number are now trying to entrench themselves in office and lock the door to reforms that could allow a majority of Americans or a majority of people in a district to turn them out.
Well, I'm going to ask each of you a question about expanding the voter base. I've gotten to be pretty good friends with Michael Steele, and it's always fun when we're on panels together talking about voting rights, when he said, how everybody says we all want everybody who's eligible to vote. That's not true. We don't want everyone to vote. We only want the people who are going to support us to vote. But we all know that that a lot of people in this country don't vote, even though we've seen record turnouts going forward. Have you given thought to maybe a Sunday ballot or a 2-day voting in place as we look at the challenges? I know there's a lot of states that are rolling back. I basically call it no-fault absentee ballots. We have a system in North Dakota that you get an absentee ballot. You can vote even if you're available on election day. There's some states that's not possible. But is there a way that we could change the way that we offer people an opportunity to vote that would actually expand the number of people voting and the number of people engaged? What do you think, Daniela? I know you have to bounce off pretty quickly, so we're going to go to you first.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that, Senator. I apologize for having to slip out slightly early. I am a big believer in full participation. So I don't agree with Michael Steele. I do want everybody to vote, even if they disagree with me. And I believe that is the job we have, that is to sort of make the case.
Well, I just want to make the point. He it's not that he doesn't believe it. He just says, people who say this, trust me, they don't believe it.
Fair enough. Got it. That's an important correction. I appreciate that. Thank you. So at any rate, for Our Common Purpose report, we definitely took the all of the above position. So we advocated for that no fault absentee ballot approach. We advocated for early voting, being able to have sort of extended times of voting. We advocated for a national holiday for the federal election, the November federal elections. So I do think all of those things that remove barriers to participation are incredibly valuable. I think at the same time that we have to recognize that motivation matters. So I also really like to say to people, look, when we're inviting people to participate, we need to invite them to participate in something worth their time. So for me, all the other reforms we're talking about are so important to actually achieving healthy participation. Again, if you don't have competitive elections, what's the point of turning out? It doesn't matter how easy it is. So I really see all these things as coming together. But yes, it should drive up healthy participation. And thanks again for the great conversation. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you. And keep doing your important work. Our democracy depends on people who are thinking the way you're thinking and advocating the way you're advocating.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Take care. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Nancy, what do you think about how we could get more people to actually vote?
Well, in this area, I think Michigan provides a great example. Also, we do have no reason absentee voting right now, guaranteed in the Constitution. We have 9 days of early voting, including 2 weekends, and all of that is because of citizens' initiatives. There was one in 2018 that passed by 67%, and then one in 2022 that passed by 62%. And again, people want to vote. They want to vote, across party lines. Everybody wants everybody else to vote. They want to have a fair system. They want their vote to count, and that's where redistricting comes in as well. It is all related. They want to hear why voting matters to them, and we have education modules right now where we are talking to people about local elections and why they're important. What issues do you care about? These are the ones that are decided on the local level. So I think all of those things in conjunction, but certainly breaking down those structural barriers is so important, and then encouraging people and convincing people that their vote counts and is important. That's what we are trying to do in all of these different, kinds of ways to bring more people into the process.
So, David,
I'd give a hearty endorsement to everything Danielle and Nancy just said. Right, all of these things are tied together; they're connected. We ought to embrace all of the reforms that make voting easy and safe and fair, but we also want to give people elections in which their votes are meaningful and votes are competitive. I would tie it, right? We're at the Rural Progress Summit, and I would say that one of the impediments, I would imagine, to rural progress is that these districts have been drawn in such a way, especially for state legislature or state senate in so many of these states, that there are probably a whole lot of states where Democrats barely field a candidate, barely knock on doors, and folks haven't actually laid eyes on a living, breathing Democrat other than some kind of Fox News boogeyman for some time. And that when you knock on somebody's door and have a conversation and talk about issues, that's how you come to some common ground. That's how you realize that we have more in common than not, right? I feel like that's the story of Idaho, the wonderful story of Reclaim Idaho, how they expanded Medicaid there through the ballot initiative after the state legislature did not do it again and again and again. And they won also with 61% of the vote in a state, as red as Taylor Swift's lipstick, right? But voters wanted to see that kind of change. And after 2018 and that passed, who knew that there would be a pandemic in 2020 and that the $500 million that helped rural hospitals in Idaho stay open was there because people went out and knocked on doors and talked to their neighbors about issues and realized they had things in common that their politics kept divided in an unnatural and unhealthy way.
Yeah, this 13%, that represents the work of so many legislators, so their immediate reaction to that, and you saw it in Missouri when Missouri voted to expand Medicaid, was to ignore the voters because they felt like I don't have accountability as long as I keep my hardcore base. I want to kind of close with kind of a history lesson. The history of the American Constitution has been a history of expansion of voting rights, right? So people of color were denied the right to vote. Women were denied the right to vote. And it's only been in the last 100 years that women have had the right to vote. Young people were denied the right to vote. We were electing the Senate at the state legislative level as opposed to direct election of senators. And so when you look at the arc of history of our democracy, it has been the history of the expansion of the franchise. We're at a pivotal point right now in that history, in my opinion. We're at that point where we need to re-examine kind of the forces that will always push us back. And you know, all along, the forces that have always fought against extending the franchise, because it means you have to share political power. It means that you have to give a voice to people who haven't had a voice before. And so if you could just give me an evaluation from your perspective and your work, how critical is it now? Are we overstating this as a threat to democracy, or do we really need to be all hands on deck thinking about this the way we would think about making sure we have quality education? Is democracy really in peril? And do we need to be much more aggressive on these reforms? And I will start with you, David.
Thank you, Senator. A pleasure to be on this panel again. Thanks to everybody for putting this on. It's a really important conversation. Thrilled to have it. My good friends Nancy and Danielle. The history of democracy in this country, I would say, is the history of push and pull. It's been a tug of war for the kind of multiracial democracy that I think we would like to live in, or many of us would like to live in. We are a multiracial nation. The question is whether we can become a multiracial democracy. And the answer to that question has been a tug of war for as long as we have been a country. There is the optimistic way of looking at this, which is that it's been an arc of progress, an arc of expansion. I think it's probably more accurate to say that it's been an arc of expansion followed by contraction. That there's been a counter effect to each and every one of those expansions of the vote, and that we are living right now in the middle of another one of those contractions. The nation is changing. It is increasingly difficult to deny that this is a multiracial nation, and the question of whether we can become a multiracial democracy, I think, is going to define what happens and where we go from here. And it's why, I mean, Dr. King talked about a moral arc of the universe that bends towards justice, and I think that what is so important for us all to remember is that the arc does not bend towards justice on its own.
Yeah.
The arc bends toward justice when all of us, you, me, our neighbors together, put our hands on it and pull it in the direction towards justice. Because oftentimes there are those who are trying to pull it in the other way. And so this is a crucial moment. This is the fight of our time, and it takes all hands together on that arc.
There is so much resistance to expansion of the voting franchise that it's going to take people who believe that this is critical to preservation of our democracy to push back. So Nancy, we're going to give you the final word because you're doing amazing work in Michigan. We just wish we could multiply you and deploy you all across the country, especially given that you can get 61% of the people in Michigan to agree with you. So final word about how important this work is to preservation of our democracy.
Yeah, I think, my experience in Michigan is it showed me that we are absolutely under threat, right? There are candidates, there are forces, there's huge money, big and dark money, that are working to keep people in power and in power, whether they got there unfairly, kind of using gerrymandering or not. And at the same time, it gives me so much hope because you are seeing we're voters, not politicians. We're not Republicans, we're not Democrats. We are voters that were able to unite together for a common cause, which was to protect our democracy. And people are paying attention. They're coming out and they're supporting things like gerrymandering reform, voting rights, and now, campaign finance reform. I mean, we're going around the state just like we did, when we first started talking to people about, what they thought the biggest problems were and how we can protect our democracy. What are the most important, steps we can take? And we are seeing interest and concern and really inspiration and kind of motivation to act all across the spectrum and all across the state, cities, rural. And that's what gives me hope, is that people understand that it's our political power and it's time for us to act collectively to take it back.
Amen. And I am so gratified by the work of so many citizen groups, people who don't have any skin in the game. You're not representing a political party, voters, not politicians, people who care about making sure that every voice is heard and every voice has an opportunity. We have dirt road Democrats that are, David, who are working to trying to solve the problem of nobody running in these districts, getting so discouraged, actually having a dialogue. That's something new, where we're seeing more and more people unchallenged because of gerrymandering or because they just can't find the resources to run. I cannot emphasize enough that final five voting would change some of that too, so there'd be real choices. So thanks so much, you guys. What a great conversation. Keep up your great work. Check in with us. We'll try and amplify that work at One Country Project, because we think it is so critical to making sure that rural America is not one party America, but represents the diversity of thought and feeling and attitudes that reflect the people, not just the predominant, very right-wing part of our country. So good luck to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us.